So my talk is about learning from previous struggles, what we as vegans can learn from previous struggles. I'm going to be talking mainly about the abolitionist movement, but also the suffragettes in the UK. So I want to just point out a couple of things. Everything I'm going to share with you is just information that I found from my research. They don't reflect my personal opinion, feelings, or ideas. Which means that if any of you sees any information that is either misleading or wrong or could be fixed, please raise your hand. Don't feel pressure at all. Just correct me or straight away. It's completely open to everyone to share whatever they want. Another thing I want to share is, since we're talking about other types of oppression, I'm definitely not here to compare any victim's feelings or experience of oppression. I'm going to simply be talking about the mindset of the oppressor. So if at any point you feel that there's a comparison being made, it's really a comparison only on the level of the mindset of the oppressor and not the feelings and experience of the victims. So we're going to start with the women's rights movement and the suffragettes. In 1832, the first women's suffrage bill was presented to the parliament in the UK. Now, at this time, women had been already campaigning peacefully for equality and the right to vote for decades. But all this time they were being completely ignored. They were mocked by the government and mocked by society. And we're talking about a time where laws were really, really sexist and immoral, like kidnapping a woman who was under the age of 18 was just a misdemeanor. But if it's over the age of 18, it's actually a crime. But that's only because over the age of 18, then you have the consent. So therefore, she becomes almost like a pride or object. So under that age, if you kidnap someone, then it's just a misdemeanor and you can get away with it. So these are the types of laws that they were fighting against, and they were completely ignored. And what happened was that between 1907 and 1918, the suffragettes took the battle to another level, and they started using civil disobedience. Now, for years and years and decades, they were fighting and they were completely ignored until they started using civil disobedience. And so they started storming into the House of the Parliament, and in just 1 week, they got more coverage in the press than they did for whole 50 years. Now, here we see Annie Kenney in 1905. During the protests, they did marches, they did protests, including one huge protest that took over London. There was 250,000 people, and this was the largest political rally ever. Now, during this protest, they even went further and they broke windows. What they used to do is they used to take little rocks and then tie little notes to the rocks, and the notes had messages about equality or their fight or their message, and they used to throw it at the windows of the stores that were basically selling just any product, but mostly like clothing stores and things like that, because they believe, well, if we're going to just be ignored, then might as well do something that's going to catch the attention. And as they saw, in 1 week they got more coverage, so they realized that this is working. Another thing they did is they tied themselves to railings. So there's just a lot of things that they decided it's time to change, from just being peaceful to also being more civilly disobedient. They even took part in arson attacks, and the worst one that happened, or the best in their fight, was in 1913 when Emily Davison, what she did was she went to the Derby, and next slide. She went to Derby during the horse race, and when the king's horse approached, she literally stood out and she stood in front of the horse, and she got hit by the horse, and from the injuries she died. Obviously this was very tragic, but for the first time they really had a massive, massive impact on the whole country, and they really made the subject be put on the table. Now, it wasn't until 1918, when the World War was taking place, when women actually had more value, let's say, in society. And it was basically thanks to the militancy that they were using, but also because of the war. A lot of men had gone to war, and women for the first time had the opportunity to show men or the ruling power that they are actually useful and they can do anything that a man can do. So the mix of both the times of war and the militancy that they had, they managed to get the right to vote, but it was only over the age of 30, while men could vote over the age of 21. And it took another 10 years after that, in 1928, when everyone got the right to vote over the age of 21 years old. Now, until now, historians say that obviously the war played a huge role, But another thing that happened was the government just did not want to go back and concentrate on all the violent tactics that the suffragettes were using in the UK, while at the same time they were dealing with all the war and all the violence that had to do with the war. So both put together, it had a great impact, and I just wrote down like the tactics and the counterattacks that they had. The tactics were peaceful campaigns, lobbying and petitions, public meetings, leafleting, chaining, arson, property damage, disruptions, demonstrations, and obviously the idea of deeds and not words. So we're not going to just say we're going to do something, but we're actually going to do it. We're going to walk the talk. And the mistake that they had, and I want to, like, whatever I found was a mistake, I put it, and I've done the same with the other struggles as well, was there was some racism. Unfortunately, they kind of used an argument which was, how can white women not vote when black men can vote? And so giving women the right to vote gives white supremacy more power, because then white people have more like word in society. And we have to learn from this, obviously. It's a struggle for, well, against oppression and for liberation, and we're doing the same thing, and we have to keep in mind that we can't really obviously fight for the liberation of, let's say, in this case, for the right to vote and for equality, while using extremely racist or any other oppressive tactics. Now, the counterattacks that they were facing, which also I want to compare, is political campaigns against them. There was a lot of intimidation as well. For example, the government, instead of introducing the women's suffrage bill, they actually introduced another manhood suffrage bill. So they switched the attention completely from women that they were trying to bring to the table to men. It's quite intimidating. It's almost like when, let's say, an article is shared about, I'm sorry if there's anybody who gets triggered by this, but if an article is being shared of the rates of women getting raped in society, and someone comments, well, men get raped too. Well, yeah, obviously they do, but like, now we're talking about women, so don't just, that's quite intimidating, and that's what the government was doing. And they thought that by intimidating that way, they would like get them so much that the suffragettes would back up. But they also ignored them, and there was actually a movement that was anti-suffragism, and it was a deep-rooted fear that women, if they become politically, well, basically they will be masculinized by their entry into political life, which is quite weird, but somehow they managed to come up with that. And the other thing they did was mocking them completely, so they made postcards on which they wrote poems about how all these women and like women's rights fighters or suffragettes, they keep on complaining, and you can change. They keep on complaining, and at the end they go and live in the house that was built by a man, which obviously is quite stupid, but these were sold as postcards in the country. So imagine if you're, like, we don't have this going on, fortunately, in our movement, but imagine there are postcards being sold in the cities where we're fighting for animal liberation against vegans and talking against vegans. So it was quite powerful for the government to actually decide to go this far in the fight. But it just shows how much they enjoyed having the upper hand, and they took advantage of it. So that's the suffragettes movement. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is the next part is the abolitionist movement. And it all started in the late 1700s. And the grassroots anti-slavery movement started in England, actually, before the USA. It was the first movement where the people who fought were not the direct victims. And by this, I mean it was 800 workers in a metal factory, actually, that were British, that were not slaves, who actually said, well, we're not going to continue doing this because the metal factory we're working for, they use these products to actually, sometimes they use it as money, but sometimes as trade on the ships that were bringing slaves. And that was just 800 people. So they understood that they had power that they can use to hopefully end oppression. Obviously, they had no idea if it's going to work, but it's quite powerful where less than 1,000 people decided that you can change the world, while they were living in a world where 3/4 of the population was a victim of slavery. That's in South America and India and the Islamic world and the United States. So doing so was considered extremely insane given the amount of people they were versus the amount of oppression that existed. And that's why I really love the next quote that I'm going to share by Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Now, what can we as vegans learn from the tactics that were used and the counterattacks? The tactics were boycott to start with. A lot of them boycotted sugar because it came from, the slave trade industry was a part of it. And it's quite, well, similar to what we're doing. Obviously, we're kind of using a boycott system where we don't buy animal products. They also did pamphleting, they did education, they did civil disobedience, they liberated slaves like Harry Tubman's Underground Railroad, who used to use a specific road to liberate slaves from south to north of the United States. And then they did obviously also political campaigns. But unfortunately, there was also a mistake that they had, which was the presence of sexism. One specific case was when two women went to a conference to build more coalition. They were denied entry literally because they're women. So that's also, we see in two exactly different fights the oppression that they had actually against each other. So the counterattacks of the industry was health. Now, obviously, because they boycotted sugar, the industry somehow managed to get into the health system, and they started telling people, well, you can't boycott sugar because you need to eat sugar to survive. You've heard that before, right? So it just shows how similar they are, the way they oppress people. Obviously, they used a lot of propaganda. There was actually a play, a theater play in London taking place, where it was the story of a couple from Africa taken away as slaves, and by their beautiful luck, they managed to live on two different lands, but by two different owners. But because they were next to each other, and these slave owners were so nice, and they took so much care of their slaves that they actually let them live together and get married. And this was actually a theater play being shown in London. So it just shows the propaganda of, farmers love their animals, but the slave owners, they took so much care of their slaves. So it's really the same kind of layers that we see over and over again. They passed, obviously, lobbying laws. They used euphemism the same way we have now with all the words that we use, instead of saying what it is really called. They actually started calling slaves voluntary planters because it just sounds so much better for them. And obviously, the worst one that they used is welfarism. Now, this is actually a boat designed to show that from now on, all the slaves that we're going to bring from Africa, they're going to have more space to move while on the boat than the previous boats that we were using. And this is something that we see as well in the animal agriculture industry, welfarism. Now we have bigger cages, or we have no cages, or this and that. So it's just the same type of tactics that they're using, basically. And actually, about this boat, I found word by word written. It says, if the weather is sultry and there appears at least perspiration upon their skins, when they come upon deck, there are two men attending with clothes to rub them perfectly dry, and another to give them a little cordial. They are then supplied with pipes and tobacco. They are amused with instruments of music peculiar to their own country. So they're even proud of the fact that the slaves can come upon deck and then play music and be happy, apparently. So now I want to talk about what we have in common. So to start with, the people fighting against are not directly the oppressed, especially when it comes to the slave trade industry. The abolitionist movement that started, obviously there were also a lot of slaves fighting for their freedom and liberation, and they did very well, and they managed to win. But the movement that started in the UK, those 800 metal factory workers that started everything, they were not directly oppressed the same way we are not directly oppressed by the animal agriculture industry. The industry makes billions of dollars every year off it. They have a lot of political power and lobbying. They are based on brainwashing and social conditioning, and the consumer has the power. Now, the difference is that 99% of the world population is a direct customer of the animal agriculture industry, while around 30 to 50% of the American citizens were slave owners, depending on states. This is why we have to direct most of our activism, at least in my opinion, into changing the customers' habits. And even though they have a lot of lobbying, at least if we manage to change the customer habits, let's say 50 or up to 70% of the customers, then they really have no other option, because at the end of the day, they just care about money. And if we can take that away from them, then there's no reason for them to continue. Now, what is also different between us is we are quite divided, and I think it's safe to say we really have to start organizing better, because when we look at the numbers, the difference that we have between us and the abolitionist movement is quite big. With them, they only had to address up to 50% of the population. With us, it's up to 99%. With them, they grew much faster, much bigger, much faster. With us, 1% of the world population is vegan, 1% of that 1% is activist. It's still very slow and very small. Now, I want to talk about quite a touchy subject, let's say, but also a subject that I think that should be talked about. It's very important because it affects every single one of us and it affects the animals. And this was not originally in my slide. It's just while doing, in my presentation, it was more like while doing more research, because I always knew that maybe I was finding more information or fixing information, I came across things that were also connected to it. And I want to talk a bit about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Does anybody not know any of these two? No shame, you can raise your hand, really. Wow, someone's lying. All right, it's all right. So basically they both fought for civil rights. Martin Luther King had a more peaceful approach of turning your other cheek, while Malcolm X is more like, if they touch you, you know what to do. So they had literally the same goal. They both believed in the liberation, in ending racism and segregation, but they couldn't have more different approaches to fight for it. It was exactly in the opposite direction. So what they used to do was, let's say Martin Luther King would have a huge rally in which obviously there's going to be police brutality, but he doesn't like violence. He just says, turn your other cheek. So Malcolm X would show up with his people and he would take care of the police just to make sure that they don't touch the ones walking for Martin Luther King. Now, at one point, I didn't know this in the first time I did the presentation, but then I found out it actually happened. Malcolm X did publicly criticize, Martin Luther King only once, that is at least recorded. And it was just like mocking that it's maybe too peaceful. And obviously that was not nice of him, but then he had a very good explanation. So when Martin Luther King was once in a hospital, Malcolm X went to visit and he couldn't talk to him, so he talked to his wife. And he explained something that I think is just genius on all levels. So basically what he said was, we both want the same thing. I'm here to show support, obviously, for Martin Luther King. And I just wanted to tell you, to let you know as well, that what I'm doing is just going to push more people to go to him. And his idea was, so if he's very peaceful and I'm very violent, well, violent is not the perfect word because in his words it's self-defense, it's not violence, obviously. But he was saying, if the public sees me as violent and they want to join the fight, but they don't like violence, they're going to go to Martin Luther King, which I'm very happy with because we both want the same thing. So I don't care if we get there with his help or through my work. And so what he was saying basically is kind of like almost a marketing strategy. If I ask someone like, hey, do you want this water? You can either say yes or no. But if I ask you, do you want this water or that water? You're going to choose one of them. And that's what they were doing. So they were both giving the same idea, and people, whether they liked it or not, they had to choose one of them because they thought they have the illusion of choice and they couldn't say no. So this is very, very powerful, and I think we should all learn from, maybe even if we don't agree on the ways of doing it, as long as obviously it's not ethically wrong, then we should collaborate. If it's not on the table, then under the table, so that we make people go to the same destination, because that's what we all want. So the amount of trust that Malcolm X had actually in the movement is what got him killed. The day that he was giving the speech, the day that he was shot, there was a lot of infighting in the movement. The FBI, the CIA were investing a lot into getting people into the movement, passing information about him. And they basically stirred the movement and got some hate in it, got some jealousy in it, involved money in it, and that kind of started violence. So Malcolm X was supposed to give a speech, and when his friends said, well, we're going to put someone on the door, so everyone who's coming in for the speech, we will search them for weapons. And he had so much trust that no one would ever involve themselves in infighting, that he told them, I would never want a black man to think I don't trust him. And that's how he got killed, because he trusted them and they had guns and they killed him during his speech. So it just shows how dangerous infighting can be and how powerful our words could be if we could all be against infighting, to the point that we can say, no, I don't want someone to feel that I don't trust him, so even if they're going to carry a gun, let them walk in. So after this, I just want to hopefully share some stats with you that would probably put you down a bit, but they're all realistic facts that I think are very, very important to share. And I hope that if it puts you down, just like vigils could put you down, you could use it as a fuel for your activism, and you can be more active or be more creative or do whatever you can for the animals. So, I want to talk about what is going on right now in the vegan movement, in my opinion. So this year, obviously 2018, we all heard it, this is the year of, 2017 was the year of veganism, this year is the year of vegan activism, this year is for the animals, veganism is on the rise, fastest growing social justice movement, all amazing. But we have to stay realistic, because as long as we're being illusionally positive, if that's a word, is it a word? Illusionally or delusionally? Well, but you know what I mean. So if we're so positive that we create this bubble in our head, then we're not going to fight effectively, because we're gonna fight in the ways that we think we should fight, which is based on too much positivity. And I am for positivity, but let's also stay realistic while being positive. If something very bad happens, that sucks. But all right, what are we going to do to fix it? Not like, no, it doesn't suck, it's amazing, now we can do it. So these are some pictures that, I took screenshots of different articles. Veganism skyrockets to 7% of UK population. 7% of UK is vegan now. And everyone was sharing this. Even it made me happy, because I read it, that's amazing. But then everyone was sharing the article, and I was like, all right, let's look into it. So the study was actually asking, not yet. So the study was actually asking environmentalists, how many of them identify as vegans, and 7% of them do. Now, in my opinion, not only this is not a win, this is a quite massive loss. If 7% of environmentalists are activists, that's nothing to celebrate, because with all the information and facts and documentaries we have today, if we've only convinced 7% of them, let's make an article that says 7% of environmentalists identify as vegan. How could we change that? And then we can work on it, because we see this study, 7% of the UK is vegan. Then, it's a win for the animals, win for the movement. It's just not. It's not like, it's almost a disservice, because then we're not gonna take the measures that we're supposed to take to fight the battle the right way. So this is some charts of the global animal products consumption. And with the rise of the vegan movement, as amazing as it is, we also have to keep in mind that animal products consumption is also on the rise. Now, that doesn't mean that we're failing, because this includes all the other countries in the world where veganism is not on the rise. And a lot of these countries are developing countries like China, Brazil, Argentina, even India. And they have very, very large populations. And the world population is on the rise as well. So we cannot just ignore these facts. We cannot just claim victory when more animals are being killed. What we can celebrate, obviously, is that if the vegan movement is growing in this part of the world, hopefully we can influence these other developing countries, because a lot of developing countries, because of colonialism, look up to the Western world and other European countries as ways of life and just lifestyle in general, and hopefully then they can adapt veganism with time. But we have to be careful with that. For example, now we have China building gas chambers for their pigs that so far they used to import from European countries like Denmark. And when you have a country like China of, I think, 1.2 billion population, building gas chambers, that's not going to be good for the movement, that's not going to be good for the animals. So we have to share these facts, we have to share these articles just to keep more, like, I don't know if you can say, keep your foot on the ground. Don't be too high up in the clouds when celebrating without making sure that you're fighting on all the levels. So this is, next please. So this is actually the first part of the talk that I gave about, the suffragettes not, but the slave trade industry and the abolitionist movement was actually inspired from a talk that I saw on a website called humanemyth.org. You should check it out, it's amazing. Most of the things I shared is taken from there. And this one is taken, I learned about it from a YouTube channel called Are We Winning? And Jake Conroy, his name, if I'm correct, and he shared this fact. Did you know that in 1990, in Washington, D.C., up to 30,000 people were walking for animal rights? 30,000 people. When was the last time we saw that? We saw it in Israel, but was that an animal rights march? From people that were there, they told me they saw a lot of just cat and dog lovers, which is good because they showed up and the numbers help. But when you have 30,000 people attending in 1990, and then in 1996, 3,000 people attend, then we have to ask ourselves what's happening. And about last year, I didn't even find the numbers because I didn't find even a page that showed, maybe there was one, but I didn't find it, an event for the Animal Rights March in Washington, D.C. So we really have to ask ourselves, what is it that we have done wrong ever since? And I don't have the answer. That made 30,000 people come down to 3,000 in 1996, and now 28 years later, or even more, not 28. Yeah, 28 years later, numbers are still low. If the movement is growing, there's no reason why this 30,000 should not be 100,000, for example. And when we start claiming victory without basing our victory or win on facts and numbers and statistics and actual studies, and looking into the studies on who the studies were done for, then we're not really being realistic, and we're not being effective, and it's doing a disservice for the animals. Now, when all of this is happening, this is a very personal point of view or opinion, but when I imagine the animal agriculture industry being asked about the vegan movement, this is what I see. And this is not to put you down, all right? This could be changed, and it will be changed. But we have to be realistic, in my opinion, really. If anybody wants to share something, we can talk about it. And the reason why I do this is not because I think that I know more and then we're not doing good and then so it's worthless and they're laughing at us. It's just that 1% of the 1% of the world population is a very small number. And I think personally what is happening is we are very active, we're doing a lot of great work, but there's also a massive misunderstanding, or at least lack of communication when it comes to what activism is. A lot of us, including me, until a couple of months ago, only talk about activism or refer to activism as being on the street. And that's not only activism. As James showed, 2 million views just from holding a camera. All right, they were with an activism movement inside, but that could be anything. It could be a YouTube channel about recipes, like Freely the Banana Girl, first vegan I ever found when I became vegan. I didn't even know anything else, and she helped me a lot, as weird as that sounds, but she's reached millions of people, maybe millions more than we could ever do in our lifetime personally. And I think the idea of activism is switching from doing anything for the animals to only cubes of truth or circle of compassion or vigil or this or that. It doesn't have to be. If you don't feel comfortable doing any of the types of activism that is known to the community, it doesn't mean you're not an activist. Literally anything could be activism. So I think that we are more divided than ever, and the numbers that we saw from the marches show that. We're kind of closed. I think we should reach out to more minorities as well, other movements. We should reach out to the environmentalists, see how we can change that, because a lot of people care about the environment. And a lot of people go vegan for the animals after going vegan for the environment. Actually, Christina from Barcelona Animal Save, when I met her, she wasn't vegan, and she even said, if you find me vegan bacon that tastes as good as real bacon, I'll go vegan. And obviously that didn't happen, but then she watched Cowspiracy and she messaged me, she said, I'm going vegan for the environment. And now she's an animal rights activist full-time and doing a lot of great things for the movement. So if we can reach out maybe more and start building coalitions with the environmentalist movement, then I think, in my opinion, that would make us much, much stronger than we are today. And then we can change this picture to them crying, hopefully. So I just want to share some numbers, which are kind of, again, sad, but they're true numbers, and I think they should be shared as fuel for activism. So 97.5% of water on this planet is salt water, which we can't drink nor use for crops. 2.5% of the Earth's water is fresh. Of that 2.5%, 69.5% is locked up in glaciers, snow, and permafrost. 30% is deep beneath the ground, and 0.5% of that 2.5% is surface and atmospheric water. And we're running out of water, and by 2025, 5.3 billion people will suffer from water shortages. And this is something we can use with environmentalists. Now, why could we use that? It's very obvious, because all the water is being used for the animal agriculture industry. So between 20 and 40% of the planet's oxygen is produced by the rainforest. These are the lungs and the filtration system of the earth, and we're destroying it. Cattle grazing and clearing land to grow crops is responsible for the loss of 80% of our rainforests worldwide. And around the world, almost a third of all land, and not just rainforest land, is becoming desertified. So every year, 1.4 billion tons of solid animal waste is produced in the United States alone. That's 130 times more the amount produced by humans. All this waste obviously goes in the lakes, in the rivers, and the oceans. And around 3/4 of the fisheries that we have out there are either fully exploited or overexploited, as we kill 2.7 trillion fish every single year. And I want everyone to remember to say this number. Let's not stick to only 60 billion land animals, because there's nothing that differentiates land animals from marine animals, and the number is not 60 billion. There's no reason for us to only say 60 billion when we're talking about all animals, otherwise it's quite speciesist. It's 2.7 trillion animals.
80,000 a second.
80,000 a second. Thanks for making it worse. So, 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef has been damaged as a result of climate change, and scientists expect obviously fishless oceans by 2048, followed by a complete ecological collapse. And this is why I really want everyone to reflect on whether or not we're winning as well as we think we're winning. Now, are we winning in general? I think we are, because the rise of the movement is like multiplicating. The ratio that is going higher is much better than ever. But let's just stay with our feet on the ground and make sure that we're always following and not being, as I said, illusionally positive. So let's learn from previous struggles. Let's learn to not oppress anyone when we are fighting against oppression ourselves. Let's learn to fight from our hearts and minds and remain completely realistic. Let's learn to not let anyone divide us. Let's learn to accept and give constructive criticism. There's really no way for me to put more importance on the word constructive in that sentence. Criticism alone does not help you, does not help the person you're criticizing, does not help the animals, does not help any humans. Constructive criticism is when you see something wrong, and instead of bashing the person, you reach out to them personally. You ask to talk to them. You say, hey, I think this is wrong. Do you think we can talk about it? Do you think we can make it better? And that's something we really, really need in the moment. So let's learn to accept and give constructive criticism. Let's learn to grow, and let's learn our weak points and strengthen them. Let's learn that in the fight of animal liberation, education is our strongest tool. And finally, let's learn the battle for full liberation is a battle that will be achieved by a united movement that builds coalitions and understands that any and all means are necessary. Now I would like to finish it with Martin Luther King's quote of those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. Thank you.